Today we pick up with chapter 20.1, the first subsection of the chapter 20, and we're going to be dealing with international finance. Now the first thing we're going to deal with in international finance is trying to understand exchange rates. Now to understand exchange rates, we need to lay down some basic facts about the world. The first fact is that the vast majority of countries have their own currency. There's a handful of exceptions, and the euro is the most obvious exception, where many countries in Europe have banded together. They've given up their own individual country currencies, and they all use a common currency called the euro. Now, a handful of other countries have also adopted the US dollar as their currency. So instead of their government printing their own money, they simply use US dollars. But of course, those are two exceptions. The vast majority of countries in the world issue their own currency, such as the Canadians issue the Canadian dollar, the Americans issue the American dollar, the Mexicans issue the Mexican peso, and we could go on and on and on of all the different countries with all their different currencies. What makes this interesting is we now start to get an interesting complication whenever we get involved in international trade. Unlike domestic trade, for instance, somebody in the state of Georgia buys a, say, a beach house from somebody in Florida. Now, how many currencies do you need? Well, just one, right? Because both Georgia and Florida both use the same currency. As long as you can work out a deal that makes both sides happy enough to enter into the transaction, it moves forward with one currency. But consider an international transaction. Let's assume that you want to buy a condo on the beach in Mexico. Now you got yourself an extra layer of problems because obviously the Mexican seller of the Mexican condo wants to be paid in Mexican pesos so that they can go shopping. I mean, obviously they don't, they want their own currency. But an American, of course, doesn't have Mexican pesos. The American has dollars. So now we're going to have two currencies involved in the transaction. And somehow we're going to have an exchange of currencies in order to make this transaction take place. So that's what makes international finance both way more interesting, but also a little bit more complicated because now we have to get involved in something called exchange rates. Now, what is the exchange rate? The exchange rate is the price of one currency in terms of another currency. So it's how much does our currency, our meaning, always from the point of view of the domestic person, and of course that's a relative term. If you're an American, then being an American is the domestic person. If you're a Mexican in Mexico, then being a Mexican is the domestic customer. So the point, of course, is it's always from your own point of view. So the way we do this, and we have some numbers here on our screen, let's assume that it takes $1.50 to purchase 1 euro, because you want to buy something in Europe, so you need a euro. It takes $1.50 to do it. But that's not how you represent the exchange rate. The exchange rate is always in terms of what does 1 unit of my domestic currency purchase of the foreign currency. So you notice right next on the same line where it says it takes $1.50 US to buy 1 euro, the exchange rate is 1 US dollar equals 0.67 euro. Now, how did I come up with that number? How do we get that exchange rate? Well, just do it. All we do is a little bit of math. Now, this is high school level math, so don't worry about it. Just remember, whenever you take an equation that has an equal sign somewhere in it, whatever you do to the left-hand side of the equation, on the left-hand side of the equal sign, as long as you do exactly the same thing to the right-hand side, the equation still remains equal. So, let's take a look at how do you turn $1.50 equals 1 euro. How do you make that $1.50 1 American dollar? Well, you should be able to see right here on my slide. I've already done the math for you. If you take $1.50 and divide it by $1.50, by definition, anything divided by itself turns into the number 1, correct? So now we've got 1 US dollar on the left-hand side of the equation. But remember, as long as you do exactly the same thing to the right-hand side of the equation, the equal sign will still be true. So what was on the left-hand side of the equation? Well, a second ago, it was 1 euro. But if you take over here, 1 euro divided by the $1.50, because you've already done that to the left-hand side, now you've done it to the right-hand side, the equation is still equal. When you actually do the math, now get out a calculator and do this pretty easily, it turns into $1 equals 0.67 euro. Okay? So I recommend you do this. This is not the actual exchange rate. I picked what I hoped would be nice, easy, round numbers that we could do the math pretty quickly, either in our heads or with a calculator very quickly. I want you on your own time, just Google it in the U.S. and just ask the Google, what is the exchange rate of euros for dollars, and then you'll see that they'll either report it from the American point of view of $1 equals how many euros, or from a European point of view, how many dollars can you buy with 1 euro. Now let's take a look at what happens if if the exchange rate changes. Now it only takes, in this example, $1.25 to buy 1 euro. So what's happening? Is the dollar strengthening or weakening if it takes fewer US dollars to buy the same number of euros? That's another complication. The first thing people see in their mind is you go from 150 to $1.25. Oh, the US lost value. The US dollar lost value. But that's not the right way to think about it. Remember, $1.50 buys 1 euro. Now all it takes is $1.25 to buy 1 euro. Obviously the dollar got stronger because it takes fewer of them to buy the same number of euros. So in this example, in the second example, the $1.25 equals 1 euro means the US dollar has strengthened, or you could say the euro has weakened. Either way is correct. Now, remember, this is not the proper exchange rate for an American audience. Because remember, for an American audience, we always want to start with 1 US dollar and ask how many of the foreign currency units it buys. So, doing the math, and I didn't do it for you, I want you to do it to see whether you come up with the same answer I do. Remember, divide both sides by what? $1. Both sides of this equation by $1.25. That turns the left-hand side into 1 US dollar. And then, of course, the other side would be what? 1 divided by 1.25 gives you 0.80. So you notice in this example up above, right here, 1 US dollar equals 0.67 euros. Here, 1 US dollar equals 0.8 euros. Again, your eye is very confusing because most of us would say, oh, the euro is getting more valuable. Look, there's more of them. But that's the wrong way to think about it. Remember, what we're saying here is with 1 US dollar, you can buy 0.8 euros, whereas you only used to be able to take $1 to buy 0.67 euros. Obviously, you can buy more euros now with the same $1. That dollar must have gotten more valuable, right? Or the euro must have lost value. So when you see the number of euros it takes in the exchange rate, when the exchange rate number goes up, that means the dollar is the one getting stronger and the euro is getting weaker. Okay, I know that causes some confusion and it drives everybody crazy. But if you think about it just by putting some numbers on, make up some numbers, put them on a piece of paper and say this many dollars buys this many of the foreign currency, and then change the numbers, you'll see, oh, okay, now I can see that one of them is strengthening, the other is weakening. Now, it turns out that exchange rates are reciprocals of one another. What does a reciprocal mean? That means you divide one by the other. So remember, if $1 buys 0.8 euros, what if you were in Europe and you wanted to explain to a Frenchman what the exchange rate is? They would not say $1 equals 0.8 euros. They would say 1 euro equals how many dollars? So how do you do that? Well, again, you divide both sides by 0.80, and what will that do to the right-hand side? That'll turn it into 1 euro, and then 0.8 into 1 gives you 1.25. So a European would say, in this particular example, if it's $1 buys 0.8 euros, they would say 1 euro buys $1.25 of US currency. Now, let's take a look at the impact of travel on the foreign exchange markets. Picture in your mind a US traveler traveling to Europe for vacation, okay? And so they now have a demand for euros. And what does that mean? Well, let's put it again in practical terms. You're an American and you walk into a bistro in Paris and you want to have a cup of coffee and a croissant. Well, how are you going to pay for that? You have US dollars in your pocket. That's not what the clerks want in Europe. They want euros. So you need to somehow get a hold of euros. Therefore, you demand euros, right? So you go to the bank and buy them, right? No different than if you went to a department store to buy clothes. You're buying things means you demand those things. So when US travelers travel to Europe, they demand euros, but they also simultaneously supply dollars. Because if you walk into a bank, your purchase of the euros from the bank, you're going to give them dollars to get those euros. So you're supplying the dollars to the bank is giving you euros. So you're demanding euros, supplying dollars. Now, of course, a European visitor to the US, let's say going to Disney World, they do the exact opposite. Disney World's not going to accept Mexican pesos and all the different currencies in the world. There's no way that their clerks could possibly keep track of all those currencies. They want to get paid in US dollars. So the European visitor in this example will have to demand dollars from its bank or from a bank here in the US, and that they will supply euros. So these are just two examples, but of course they generalize, meaning every time a tourist goes to a foreign country, they demand the foreign currency to spend it, and of course they supply their domestic currency to the international markets, and vice versa. Okay, how about trade? What impact does trade have on the foreign exchange markets? Well, US exporters of goods to Europe get paid in euros, but they don't want euros. Here's the problem. The US exporter needs dollars. So let's just do an actual practical example. Let's assume that you are Apple Computer in the US and you send an Apple computer to France. Of course, you're not just donating them, the French have to pay for them. Now the French have euros, so they want to pay in euros, but of course Apple wants to get paid in dollars because Apple's an American company. They've got American bills to pay, they've got employees to pay, and the employees don't want to get euros, the employees want to get US dollars so they can go shopping. So how are we going to handle this problem? Well, obviously, the US exporter now has a bunch of euros in their hand, which they're going to go to the market, meaning where the banks are buying and selling, not just banks, it could be any investor, but usually most of us work through a bank, and we go to a bank and we try to buy US dollars, we being Apple in this example. So Apple receives a bunch of euros from its European customer, goes to the bank and says, I want to buy dollars with these euros. So in that example, the importer is supplying euros to the bank and demanding dollars. And then, of course, the exact opposite is true for whenever a European exporter, let's say BMW, ships a BMW to the US. The American customer here in Georgia pays in dollars, and then, of course, the BMW company needs to have euros because it can't pay its workers in dollars, so it wants to convert the dollars it received from the sale to the Americans into euros. So how does it do that? It goes to the foreign exchange market and says, I want to buy dollars, so the European demands dollars, or rather demands euros and sells dollars. Okay, so let's take a look now. We just went through two examples, tourists and business transactions. Let's go through a complete list of all the demands for dollars there would be on the international markets. Then on the next slide, we'll do where all the supply comes from. So first thing to take a look at, where's the market demand for US dollars? Where does it come from? Well, it comes from what? Foreign demand for American exports. They're going to demand US dollars. Foreign tourists visiting America, Disney World is our example, they demand US dollars. Foreigners coming to the US to invest. Let's say you want to buy real estate. You're a Frenchman and you decide you want to have some real estate in the United States. That would be an investment in the United States, right? So obviously the Frenchman's going to have to come up with US dollars. So they will demand dollars, and of course they will supply euros to the market. Currency speculators. Some people think that the American dollar is going to become more valuable. So they obviously would demand dollars by going to the market and say, whatever my currency is, I'm willing to give it to you if you'll give me dollars. So they demand dollars. And then of course the last point, possible government intervention. Sometimes governments deliberately buy or sell currencies of either of their own or other foreign governments to change the exchange rate. So all of these reasons would be possible reasons why there would be a demand in the market by somebody who's trying to get hold of US dollars. Now remember, the market demand for US dollars simultaneously represents a market supply of foreign currency. Why? because when you enter into a market for currencies, you're always buying one currency by supplying another currency. So the demand in this example, we're all using European foreigners as our example, but it could be true for Mexicans or Canadians or anyone who's a foreigner to the United States trying to get hold of US dollars for all those reasons. They will demand the US dollars, but they supply their domestic currency, which would be foreign to us. The foreign currency, the Mexican peso, gets supplied to the market in order to demand the US dollars. So every demand for one currency is simultaneously a supply of another currency in the foreign exchange market. Now, where does the supply of US dollars comes from? Well, there's a whole bunch of groups, and we've already gone through a couple of them. Let's go back to the tourists again, or rather, let's go to the imports first. The Americans want to buy German BMWs. So obviously, they are supplying dollars to the market. They say to the international exchange market, I will give you dollars, I will supply dollars to you in exchange if you give me euros so I can go shopping for my BMW. So American importers demand, they supply US currency to the market. American tourists going abroad do the same thing, as we've already examined when our tourists tried to buy croissants and coffee in Paris. And then, of course, American investments in foreign countries. Americans invest in many, many countries, either like, say, oil companies are constantly investing in foreign countries to drill for oil. You can buy real estate in foreign countries. You can buy stocks and bonds of foreign companies. All of those reasons, if you're going to buy the foreign item, you have to bring the US dollar to the market and supply it in return for the foreign currency you're trying to buy. And of course, the currency speculators and government intervention all apply here as well. So remember now, the market supply of US dollars represents a market demand for the foreign currency. Now let's think about the value of the dollar. We simply stated what the exchange rate was. Now let's think about how the exchange rates get developed. So the value of the dollar is indicated by its purchasing power, and the same thing would be true when you're dealing with a foreign currency. Let's go through an example. Let's assume that a BMW costing 30,000 euros in Europe is going to be sold in the United States, and it's going to be priced in dollars, obviously, to sell it in the United States. Let's assume that 1 euro is equal to $1.50 from the European point of view. Then what's the price of the the 30,000 euro BMW? What's it going to cost in the US? Well, you can easily do the math. You know the dollars, it takes what, 1.5 of them to equal 1 euro. So 1.5 times 30,000 euros gives us $45,000. That's where that $45,000 number came from. Okay? So 30,000 euro BMW is a $45,000 car in the US at an exchange rate of 1 euro to $1.50. But what if the exchange rate changes and it becomes 1 euro now buys $1.60? That means the US dollar has depreciated because 1 euro buys more of the American currency, or you can say the euro appreciated. But let's look at what happens when foreign exchange values change. The BMW still costs 30,000 euros in Europe. They load it on a ship, bring it to the United States. They convert the price into US dollars. Only now it's $1.60 per euro, so 1.6 times 30,000 euros, the new price is 48,000 US dollars. You notice, as far as the Europeans concerned, the price is exactly the same. It's still 30,000 euro car. They've not changed the price. What has changed is the value of the dollar in the exchange market, forcing the price up to 48,000. So 48,000 still only equals 30,000 euros at the new exchange rate. So here's an interesting point I want you all to recognize. Prices for internationally traded goods can change dramatically in foreign markets, even when in the domestic market the price hasn't been changed at all. Because remember, in this example, the car is always 30,000 euros. No price change at all in Europe. But because the foreign exchange market changed and the value of the dollar depreciated, then you have to give more dollars to get the same number of euros. Therefore, you have to give more. You have to give $48,000 to buy what you used to be able to buy with $45,000. Okay? Now, down below, as you can see, I've done the math for you, so you can work out what this would be in exchange rates from a US perspective. At the original, 1 euro equals $1.50. That would be a $1 equals 0.67 euros. So if you looked up the exchange rate, it would say 0.67 euro. That would be the exchange rate, because it's assuming we're talking about 1 US dollar. Now, what happened? The value of the dollar fell, so $1 now only buys 0.625 euro under the new exchange rate. So in this example, you can see that the euro number gets smaller. That means the value of the euro got larger because $1 now buys fewer of the euro because the euro became more valuable in this example. Now, of course, it could have gone the other way as well, and mathematically you would just simply work it in the opposite direction. At this point, I just want you all to recognize that foreign exchange markets are going to cause businesses that are called multinational corporations. In other words, you're operating in more than one country, or even a domestic company like Disney World. Let's assume it didn't have any foreign operations. You still have foreign visitors. So oftentimes, if you accept at Disney World, if they have a foreign exchange, kiosk where they can exchange euros for dollars, then it turns out that these changes in the exchange rates can actually change the total amount of pricing that you're going to be charging. Last but not least, where does that price for the exchange rate come from that we talked about? Remember, the exchange rate is the price. Well, this looks like a supply and demand curve, doesn't it? Well, it's because it is a supply and demand curve. The supply and demand for foreign currencies generates the exact same market pricing that the demand and supply of anything does. So that part at least makes it easy. Once you've learned supply and demand, you can simply apply it to this particular market. Let's take a look here. In this example, on the green line, we have the demand for dollars, because that would be what? Foreigners trying to get hold of American dollars to come visit Disney World. Then we have a supply of dollars. This is what Americans trying to go on vacation in Europe. They're putting dollars into the market to try to turn them into euros. So we have a supply and a demand. How do we balance the supply and demand? Remember, that's the purpose of supply and demand. You want the two numbers, the demand number and the supply number, to be exactly the same. Well, you notice that this dot right here, this black dot, if they're on both curves at the same time, they have to be where the two curves cross. That's the definition of being at the same point at the same time. So at this particular price, 0.90, meaning $1 buys 0.9 euros in this particular example, is what it takes to get the number of Americans visiting Europe to equal the number of Europeans visiting the United States, or at least the dollars that they're willing to spend. I mean, it doesn't have to be literally the same number of people. It has to be the same number of currency units. How do we get everyone to agree this is the value of the currency? Well, the only way to do that is to get a particular number, in this case, 0.9 euros equal $1, gets the number of Americans willing to visit Europe equal to the number of Europeans willing to visit Disney World, as an example. Of course, there's other reasons why you would also have demand for the currency. But ultimately, that's what supply and demand in the currency markets do. They get the demand and supply of both currencies to be the same.